Welcome to Whispers of Asia. In forgotten corners of the world, beyond the veil of modern life, ancient promises still echo, whispered through banyan leaves, bound in salt and carried by the tide. Tonight, we journey to a remote village in Bali, where the dead are sent to the sea and fire is meant to free the soul. But not every spirit wants to leave. This is the story of a bride whose hair refused to burn, of black strands found in mouths, in wells, and in dreams, of a soul claimed by both land and ocean, and of a ritual that was never finished. If you believe the dead rest easy, you have not heard her cry beneath the waves. This is a tale woven in ash, seawater, and sorrow. Light a candle and listen before the tide pulls you under.
The air was thick with sandalwood smoke and salt. In the village of Banyar Pengalon, perched between jungle and sea, the people gathered beneath crimson parasols and golden streamers, their white ceremonial clothing rippling in the breeze like spirits waiting for permission to ascend. It was cremation day, Ngaben, the final rite, the release of the soul, the sacred fire that would carry the dead into liberation. But this was not a day of peace. Ayu had died too young. Only 19, only a bride for 6 days. She had drowned in the cove just past the reef, her body found tangled in seaweed and eelgrass, eyes open, mouth full of salt. Her wedding sari was still clinging to her skin when they pulled her ashore. Some said she'd gone to bathe. Others whispered she had been lured. Now she lay on the bade, the funeral tower built of wood and painted with dragons. Her hands were folded over her chest, her lips pressed in silence, and her long black hair flowed down the platform like a river of mourning. The high priest began the chants, his voice trembling between invocation and fear. Nearby, Ayu's husband, Made, knelt rigidly, his face pale beneath the ceremonial paint. He did not cry. He only stared at the hair, thick, glossy, reaching the ground. The fire was lit. It began with dry bamboo, the crackle of dried leaves, and the whoosh of ghee-fed flame. The blaze climbed up the pyre, licking the white cloth, then flesh, then bone. The crowd bowed their heads, until someone gasped. And someone screamed. The fire raged, but Ayu's hair would not burn. It curled, it twisted, it writhed, as if alive, as if it breathed. Black strands snapped upward through the smoke like serpents, coiling and dancing through the orange inferno, untouched by flame. Then came the scent, not of ash and wood, but of seawater and blood. The priest fell silent mid-chant. A baby began wailing. Chickens bolted from their cages. A gust of wind swept through, extinguishing half the fire. And there, glistening in the embers, Ayu's hair shimmered, soaked, wet, unburned. Whispers passed through the crowd like a plague. It's a sign. She is not at peace. The sea does not let go. Made's lips trembled. His eyes darted toward the horizon where the ocean met the sky, but the waves had stilled. Not a single crest moved. The priest gathered his robes and stepped away. This ceremony is not accepted. The spirit does not wish to depart. The villagers slowly backed away from the pyre. Some made offerings of fruit. Others threw petals. One old woman collapsed, clutching her chest, her eyes locked on the strands of black hair undulating like kelp in the tide. That night, the fire was left to smolder on its own, but Ayu's hair remained, untouched, unchanged, unforgiven. And deep beneath the waves beyond the reef, something began to stir. Not a fish, not a current, but a whisper, low and weeping, braided in grief. "You promised me. You took me from him. You lit the fire, but I never left."
The morning after the cremation, the village awoke in silence. No roosters crowed, no dogs barked. The waves, usually restless along the coral shore, had quieted into a breathless stillness. It was as though the sea itself were holding its breath. Made sat alone at the edge of his bed, eyes hollow. The house still smelled faintly of ghee and incense. Ayu's wedding veil hung in the corner, untouched since the day she died. He hadn't had the strength to put it away. It fluttered slightly, though the windows were closed. His fingers trembled as he reached for the clay cup of water beside him. When he drank, he choked. Not on water, on hair. A long, wet strand slid across his tongue, caught in his throat. Gagging, he coughed it out into his palm. It was black, shimmering, still wet. His stomach twisted. He dropped the cup. The clay shattered. He stared at the strand curled in his shaking hand. Then, slowly, as if moved by a breath unseen, it lifted and curled around his finger. Made wasn't the only one. Across the village, similar things began to happen. A young girl, only 6, bit into her morning banana leaf parcel of rice and screamed when a coil of black hair spilled from the center. Her mother pulled out, strand after strand, as if drawing thread from a wound that wouldn't close. An old fisherman found hair tangled in his fishing net, but it wasn't caught on anything. It wasn't attached. It had grown there overnight. In the temple, the priest discovered strands floating in the holy water basin. He drained it in fear and scrubbed the stone dry, but by afternoon it was back, coiled and waiting. One family opened their well for morning water. What they drew was brackish and smelled faintly of salt and rot. Floating just below the surface, hair. Black, silken, endless. By sunset, the elders gathered under the banyan tree to speak. They whispered of curses, of bad omens, of ritual pollution. "This is not normal." "Something was unfinished," said another. "The cremation was rejected," the priest admitted. "The spirit is unloosed. She walks between land and sea." They debated burning the remains again, but there were none, only the hair, coiled in a clay urn that no fire would consume. It sat in the temple now, sealed in a bamboo basket, but even sealed, the basket dripped, salt water. That night, Made could not sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw Ayu standing at the edge of the reef, her long black hair dripping, her back turned. She didn't speak, but he could hear her crying, not from her mouth, from the waves. He awoke choking again, and this time the hair was in his mouth and his ears. His nose bled from the pressure. He scrambled from bed, vomiting water, not his own. The floor beneath him was soaked, but the windows had not been opened. The thatch roof had not leaked. In the corner, Ayu's veil had fallen to the ground. It lay in a small pool of brine. Her comb, a carved piece of mother-of-pearl, was beside it, and wrapped around the teeth of the comb, twisted tight, was a fresh strand of black hair. The next day, villagers began sharing stories. Quietly,
shamefully. A newborn refused to nurse, something caught in its throat. When the midwife pried its mouth open, she pulled out 3 full strands of hair, wet as if from a bath. The baby didn't cry, it only stared. An old man wept as he confessed, "I dreamed of Aliyu last night. She stood in the well. I looked down, and she looked up. I think she's waiting for someone. I think she's hungry." The priest tried a cleansing ritual. He fasted. He wore the sacred white. He rang the bell 3 times and chanted in the old tongue. But when he opened his mouth to recite the final mantra, hair slid from his throat. He collapsed to his knees. The bells stopped ringing. No one helped him. They were too afraid to touch it. By the week's end, no one dared speak Aliyu's name aloud. Children were forbidden to go near the sea. Fishermen abandoned their boats. The shoreline grew quiet, untouched. But the hair remained, in tea, in towels, in closed drawers. Some even said it creeped, slowly, silently, across the floor at night. One woman swore she saw a single strand slither up her husband's leg while he slept. She watched it curl into his ear, and he never woke up. Then came the first disappearance. A boy named Raka, age 12. He was last seen drawing water from the old village well. His bucket returned full, but Raka did not. At the bottom of the well, tangled around the pulley, was a lock of hair. Long, black, wet. The village understood. This was not mourning. This was not grief. This was possession. A soul unanchored, a bride unclaimed, a promise unfulfilled, and hair that refused to burn, was the rope between the worlds. The old woman lived alone at the edge of the village, where the jungle met the tide. Her name was Ibuluh. Blind in one eye, skin like dried mango leaves, she chewed betel and spoke in half-whispers, as if the trees were always listening. She had been a midwife once, a singer of funeral chants, and a keeper of stories no one liked to hear. When the whispers about Aliyu began, about the hair, about the salt, people started avoiding Ibulu's hut. Not because she was cursed, but because she remembered. It was Made who finally came, barefoot and pale, with 3 strands of hair knotted in his hand and salt crusting the corners of his eyes. He did not speak at first. He simply knelt before her and placed the strands on the floor between them. Ibuluh did not touch them. She did not need to. She inhaled through her nose once, then again, and her good eye narrowed. "You married the sea's daughter," she said. At first, Made denied it. He said Aliyu was born of rice and land like the rest of them, a daughter of the village, a girl of soil. But Ibuluh only shook her head and spat red juice into a cracked bowl. "No girl with hair like that is meant to belong to the land," she whispered. "It smelled like tide pools since the day she bled. Didn't your mother tell you the old stories? Didn't she warn you not to take what the sea already owns?" She told him then, in slow, cracked voice, about the brides of the sea. Long ago, when storms destroyed the coast and fishermen were dragged down by invisible hands, the villagers made offerings, not just fruit, not just chickens, but girls. Infant girls, chosen at birth, marked with oil and coral, promised to the sea in quiet rituals held before dawn. Not to kill them, no, to give them. These sea brides would live, grow, and breathe the same air, but they would always belong to the ocean, and when their time came, the sea would call them home. Ayu was one of them, Ibuluch said. I was there. I helped mark her at the temple when she was 3 days old. Her mother begged for her life, so the priest made a bargain. She would live until someone tried to marry her. Made's breath caught. His lips cracked. We were in love, he said. We were happy. She said nothing about the sea. Ibuluch smiled sadly, because it was already speaking to her. The dreams of drowning, the salt in her hair, the way flowers wilted after touching her hands. She was never meant to tell you. The moment you bound her to land, she became unbound from everything else. Made wept. He wept the way only a man weeps when he realizes his grief has a shape, and that shape is a mistake. The sea gave her life, she said, but the land took her death. Now the balance is broken. Now she has nowhere to go. And worse, something deeper was unraveling. The brides of the sea, if not returned, do not rest. They spread, they reach. Hair is a thread, a tether, a net. What had begun with Ayu would not end with Ayu. The villagers had taken what belonged to the deep. Now the deep would take something back. By the time Made returned to the village, the signs had grown worse. The sacred banyan tree, the one where the spirits were said to rest, had turned gray overnight. Its roots bled salt water. Goats refused to drink. A child coughed up a strand of hair in his sleep. The priest collapsed during prayer, clutching his chest, whispering, "She's in the mirror," before losing consciousness. And still, the sea remained silent. Not angry, just waiting. That night, the tide did not come in. It pulled away, farther than it ever had, exposing coral like teeth and wreckage no one remembered. The horizon glowed faintly blue, as if something ancient had stirred just beneath the surface. Children cried in their sleep. Adults lit incense without being told. And Made, unable to bear the silence of his own home, walked to the shore. There, on the exposed wet sand, he found a comb. Ayu's comb. The mother of pearl was cracked, the teeth tangled with wet hair, and when he touched it, he heard her. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a sound like waves crashing inside his own bones. He dropped the comb and ran. Behind him, the tide did not return. In the temple, the priest recovered just enough to open the sacred scrolls. He turned through brittle pages until he found what he feared. When a bride of the sea is wed to the land, she becomes a door. If she dies unoffered, the tide will rot, the wells will weep, and her weeping will fill the mouths of the living. Burn nothing, for nothing will burn. Only the sea may reclaim what it is not yet taken. The priest closed the scroll and looked toward the urn that held Ayu's hair. It was leaking again, but this time the salt water that dripped from its seams was red. In the oldest corner of the temple, beneath fading murals of gods and oceans, the priests prepared for the rite of cleansing. The air was heavy, too still. Incense refused to stay lit. The flame on the oil lamp flickered sideways as though trying to escape. And in the shadows, Ayu's hair, what remained of it, coiled in the urn like a snake coiled in sleep. It hadn't dried. It never dried. The villagers stood at a distance, too afraid to enter. Only Made remained close, kneeling with his head bowed and fists clenched against his thighs. He had not spoken since the comb, since the tide pulled away. He only watched and waited. The priest began the Tirta Pangluktan, the purification. Chants filled the air, tremulous and low. He drew a circle of salt water around the urn, whispering the old syllables passed down from generations when gods still walked barefoot on the shore. May what was taken be returned. May what was broken be sealed. May what we cannot burn be washed clean. He poured holy water over the urn. At first nothing. Then the hair began to rise. One strand, then two, then dozens, curling up like tendrils, tasting the air, reaching for the ceiling. The priest paused. He steadied his breath. His hands began to shake. He held out the purifying talisman, a small silver fish, symbol of spiritual return, and began the recitation of salt. But the words caught. Something was wrong. He coughed. Again, and then he choked. The talisman fell. His eyes went wide. He clawed at his throat, stumbling backward, gasping, and then the hair came out from his mouth, long, wet, wrapping around his tongue, then his jaw, then his teeth. He tried to scream, but his voice was smothered by the black silk pouring from inside him like a birth reversed. The villagers cried out. Made ran to the priest, but the circle of salt water split open with a hiss. Something, not wind, pushed him back. The priest fell to his knees. His eyes rolled, and his mouth moved one last time. Groom! And then he collapsed. Silence swallowed the temple. The hair fell still, hanging from the priest's lips like a second tongue. Blood pooled at his feet. The salt circle hissed and boiled, and then dissolved. They burned his body before sundown, not according to rite. No procession, no prayers. They did it out of fear. And still, the hair in his mouth would not burn. After that, the village changed. They no longer sought to fix the ritual. They sought to contain it. The urn was buried beneath a pile of volcanic stones in the center of the temple courtyard. Salt was poured over it daily. The children were told the priest had gone away, but everyone knew. The well water had turned completely undrinkable. Animals drank and died. A local woman found her baby's crib filled with seawater and fish bones. A man opened a papaya and found a mass of hair coiled inside like intestines. And at night, they heard her, weeping beneath the ground, weeping beneath the waves. The elders begged Made to leave the village, to flee inland. They said he had brought it here. He didn't argue. He only nodded. But he didn't leave. Instead, he returned to the place it had all begun, the reef. At the edge of the rocks, where Ayu's body was pulled from the tide, he knelt and placed his hand on the stone. He closed his eyes and he whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Come back to me, or take me with you." A moment passed. Then, from beneath the water, a single strand of black hair rose. It floated slowly in the surf and wrapped itself around his finger. When he returned home that night, his fingernail had turned pale blue. Ibulu saw the signs and warned him. "She's not angry. She's waiting. She wants what she was promised. But if the land will not give her peace, then the sea will take what it can reach." And so the stories began again. of sea brides who return to drag the living into the depths, of women who wash their hair with blood under the full moon, of waves that weep and mirrors that don't show your own face. That night, salt rained from the sky, only over the village, only over their roofs. The hair in the urn began to grow again.
Maid had not spoken to anyone in days, not since the priest's mouth overflowed with Ayu's hair, not since the salt began to fall from the sky like cursed snow. He stayed in his home, the house they had shared, however briefly, where Ayu's veil still hung and her scent still clung to the walls like trapped breath. He did not eat, he did not sleep, he only listened to the sound of dripping water behind the walls, to the brush of hair against wood when there was no wind, to the weeping that came up from the floorboards at midnight. Ibulu came to him on the third night, not to comfort, but to accuse. "She waits because you broke the vow," she said. "You took her from the sea, but you gave her nothing in return, not even truth." Maid stared at her, gaunt and hollow-eyed. He opened his mouth, but at first no words came. Then, quietly, shamefully, he spoke. "I knew she was marked. I knew she belonged to the sea." The old woman did not blink, only waited, as if she'd expected this. He told her everything. How as a boy he'd watched the village elders take Ayu to the temple by the shore. How they had pressed salt to her lips, placed coral in her hands, and whispered the words no child should hear. How they said she had been promised to a spirit beneath the tide, to a force they could not name. It was the only way to save her. Ayu had nearly drowned 3 times before her first birthday. The sea wanted her. The ritual was a bargain, not a blessing. "I thought, if I married her," Maid whispered, "I could break it. I thought love would be enough." He had never told her. Not when they grew up playing under the banyan tree, not when he kissed her beneath the harvest moon, not even when he placed the gold ring on her finger and called her wife. She didn't choose. She was never given a choice, he said. Ibulu looked at him, her one good eye filled with quiet rage. "You stole her," she said. "Not from her family, not from the gods, from the ocean itself." And the ocean had noticed. In the days that followed, the curse deepened. The sea had not returned. The tide stayed far, unnatural, like it was holding itself back. The shore reeked of dead things, crabs without shells, fish with hollow eyes. A seal washed up, its mouth sewn shut with strands of black hair. In the temple, the urn had cracked. Salt water seeped from the fissures. Children began hearing voices in their dreams. "Tell him to come back. Tell him to finish what he started. Tell him I still wear the veil." One child, no more than 5, awoke with bruises around her wrist. When asked who grabbed her, she only whispered, "The bride." The elders panicked. They begged Maid to confess, to hold a second ritual, to give something back. But what could he give? There was no body to return, only hair, only salt, only silence. In desperation, they went to the sea. Not to swim, not to bathe, but to bargain. They built a raft from banana wood and placed offerings atop it, fruit, gold, Ayu's wedding comb. They burned incense. They chanted.
They pushed the raft into the unmoving sea. It floated, then it stopped, then it sank. The wind picked up. The smell of brine turned sharp like metal. And from the depths of the reef, a voice rose, not in words, but in feeling, grief, rage, betrayal, and a warning. You cannot give what was not yours. You cannot cleanse what was never clean. That night, Maid dreamed of his wedding day. The petals, the fire, the laughter. But when he turned to place the ring on Ayu's finger, her hand was blue. Her eyes were gone, and her hair wrapped around his wrist like a shackle. He awoke screaming. His hand was bleeding. Wrapped around his wrist, a single strand of wet, black hair, tied in a knot that only brides can tie.
The sea was gone, not in the way water evaporates or the way tides retreat for a time. This was different. It had left. Every morning the villagers woke to a shoreline that stretched farther than it ever had, revealing secrets that were never meant to surface. Cracked shells, black bones, stone idols half buried in sand, mouths open in silent screams. Fishermen stood at the edge, staring at their boats now stranded on dry seabed. The children, once forbidden to play near the waves, now tiptoed across salt-slick coral and asked strange questions. Who tied all this hair to the rocks? Why is the ocean whispering to me? Why is the water crying, Mama? The well turned fully brackish that week. The water was thick, heavy with salt and something else, something that shimmered faintly when held to the light. The elders said it was residue from the ocean floor, but the children knew better. They said it smelled like her, like Ayu, like jasmine and grief. A baby was born early that month, a quiet girl with a full head of black hair that moved when no wind blew. The midwife swore she heard it hum. Then the dreams returned, not to Made alone, but to everyone. Collective dreams, shared visions. They dreamed of drowning, of standing at the bottom of the sea looking up at a sky of fire, of Ayu in her veil, weeping into the water, her hair swirling around her like a cloak, calling, reaching, choosing. One child disappeared. Little Wayan, 6 years old, was last seen playing by the banyan tree. He left a trail of wet footprints leading toward the empty reef. Not a single wave had touched the shore that day, but his footprints ended in salt water. And that night his mother found a single braid of black hair resting on his pillow. In the temple, the hair in the urn had started to multiply again. No one had touched it, yet it grew like vines, twisting out from the cracked container, curling across the altar stones, reaching toward the floor as if trying to crawl. The priest's replacement refused to enter the sanctuary. He said he heard Ayu's voice in the walls, sobbing, repeating one word, "Return." By now, the jungle had begun to shift. Animals disappeared. Fruit rotted on the trees before ripening. The sky remained pale even at sunset, a washed-out, sickly color like bruised pearls. Ibu Lu declared the land unbalanced. "The sea has stepped back," she said, "and in its place, something old has begun to crawl forward." One night, the wind changed. It carried the scent of the deep ocean, metallic, raw, ancient. The villagers woke choking on seawater in their sleep. When they ran outside, they found puddles of salt in their beds, hair in their mouths,
and sand in their ears. Made could no longer walk without hearing her. The voice came from mirrors, from puddles, from anywhere the light touched water. "You promised me a fire that would free me, but you gave me ashes I did not ask for. You lit a pyre, but you never finished the offering. I cannot leave while you remain." He wandered the reef barefoot and lost, hoping she would appear, not to forgive, but to take him. Instead, he found something worse. At the farthest reach of the exposed seabed, where ancient coral had long since died, something had been carved into stone. A spiral of hair, embedded in rock, still wet, still warm, still growing. The villagers tried to hold another ritual, but no fire would catch. Not even dry leaves would burn. The wood hissed as if soaked from within. Salt had soaked everything, even the prayers. So they tried something else. They gathered all her things, the veil, the wedding ring, the comb, the fragments of her sari, and they bound it all in cloth. They tied it tight. They carried it to the reef. They buried it in a crevice filled with brine. But the next morning, it was on Made's doorstep, untouched, dry, neatly folded, with a single lock of Ayu's hair coiled atop like a question. Then came the animals. Dogs, birds, cats, all fled inland, refused to stay. Even the chickens refused to lay eggs. Life itself was pulling away from the sea, recoiling from the silence it left behind. And then the wells dried up, completely. Nothing but salt and bone dust at the bottom. In desperation, the villagers gathered again under the banyan tree. They demanded an answer. They begged Mande to find a solution. They turned to Ibulu, the last who remembered the old ways. She said only this: "This isn't a haunting. It's a bride abandoned at the altar of the sea. You cannot banish her. You must marry her again, the right way. Only then will she decide if she wants to leave." But what if she didn't? What if Ayu had no interest in leaving? What if this was her home now? That night, Made lit a candle beside her veil. He wrapped it around his shoulders. He knelt, and he whispered into the darkness, "Tell me what you want. Take what I owe you. End this." The flame flickered once, then the candle went out, and in the darkness he heard water dripping from the ceiling. One drop, then another. Then something brushed his cheek. Soft, wet hair.
They came with flowers, with incense, rice and coins wrapped in silk, with woven baskets carried with trembling hands, with hope still clinging to them like damp clothes after a storm. The villagers believed the old ways could still fix what was broken, that if they gave enough, the sea might remember mercy. So they returned to the reef. This time they came as one, no longer hiding in silence, no longer waiting in shame. Men, women, children, barefoot, bowed, breathless, each holding something precious, each whispering her name for the first time in weeks. Ayu, daughter of the deep, forgive us. Take these things and leave our dreams in peace. They placed the offerings at the water's edge, even though the water no longer touched it, neatly arranged, carefully spaced, lovingly chosen. A child's bracelet, a mother's ring, a fisherman's knife, 3 coins from a dowry that had never been used. They lit candles. They sang. They even laid out strands of their own hair, snipped by trembling hands, offering what she could not burn, hoping she would recognize the gesture. And then they waited. But the sun beat down, the wind stood still, and the sea, far in the distance, did not move. No tide came, no wave reached out. Instead, one by one, the offerings began to rot. The flowers blackened, the rice turned gray, the fruit split open, bleeding thick, black juice that reeked of brine and iron. The candles hissed and collapsed inward like they drowned from the inside. And the hair, all the hair, began to twist, tangles forming knots, knots forming braids, braids that curled like vines around each object, binding them together like a corpse prepared for burial. The villagers stepped back in horror. The reef beneath their feet trembled, then cracked, and from the fissures salt water bubbled up, not clean, not pure. It smelled like rot and blood and grief. One woman screamed. She had offered her child's bracelet and now found her child's voice whispering from beneath the sand. "Why did you give me away, Mama? I wasn't hers. I was yours." The villagers fled. They left the offerings behind. By morning, every object was gone, swallowed. Only one thing remained, a single white veil, drenched in salt, pinned to the door of the temple. The priest tried to remove it. He reached with gloved hands, but the fabric burned his skin. He collapsed, shaking, whispering that he saw eyes behind it, hundreds, blinking like barnacles, watching him from the other side. Ibulu said the veil was now a symbol. The wedding is not over. She still wears it because no one unwrapped her, no one released her, no one let her go. The village fell into chaos. Children refused to sleep. Dogs howled at mirrors. Salt crusted over doorways without explanation. Water turned bitter in pots left overnight. And every morning someone found something braided, a noose from a fishing line, a rope of seaweed at the doorstep, a necklace of black hair left on a pillow. Made dreamed again. This time he stood not at the shore, but inside the temple, alone, barefoot. The veil hovered in the air before him. Behind it, something breathed. He reached to touch it, and it touched him first. A hand, cold, slim, covered in scales. Her voice came not from her mouth, but from underneath his skin. "You buried my body in flame, but you never gave me to the sea. You took my breath, my vows, my place. You called me wife and left me tethered." He woke gasping. Salt water filled his throat. His bed was soaked, not with sweat, but with seawater. And in his palm, a coral ring, not the one he had given her, but the one she had worn as a child bride of the sea. The next day, the temple doors were found sealed shut by hair, braided, knotted, tightened until the wood warped. They tried to burn it away, but the fire turned inward. The torches melted in the bearers' hands. One man went blind, another wept blood. Offerings, the village learned, meant nothing without understanding. And the sea would not accept bribes. Only balance, only truth, only what was owed. And the veil, it remained, pinned, unmoving. Even when the wind returned, even when the tide finally began to crawl back, inch by inch, not to forgive, but to collect. It began with a single scream in the night, then another.
then another. By morning, the entire village was awake, but no one had slept. Not truly. They had all dreamed the same dream. In it, they were sinking, not in a river, not in a lake, but in her. The ocean no longer looked like water. It looked like Ayu's hair, endless, weightless, wrapping around ankles, wrists, mouths, soft at first, then tight, then choking. There was no light beneath the surface, only silence and sobbing that never reached the surface. Made had dreamed of their wedding night, the soft candlelight, the smell of jasmine oil on her skin, her laughter, warm and real. But then the room began to flood. The floorboards curled, salt water ran from the walls, and Ayu was no longer in his arms, but in the mirror, standing still, veil soaked, hair spreading across the floor like roots. She didn't speak, but her mouth opened, and from it poured a stream of water and teeth. Children woke up coughing up seawater. One girl spat out a seahorse, limp and dead, curled like a question mark on her bedsheet. A boy had his pillow soaked, not from sweat, but brine, and nestled in the center was a pearl, smooth, blood-stained. No one remembered how they got to their beds. Several were found sleepwalking, barefoot, silent toward the sea. One was caught knee-deep in the receding tide, hair wrapped tight around her legs. She whispered again and again. She said she'd braid my dreams. In one home, an elder had clawed his own face in his sleep. When he was found, he was muttering, "She's looking through me. She sees through me. She wants a door." And on the wall, scratched with fingernails, was a single word, return. The dreams deepened, became more vivid, more personal. Not visions of the sea, but memories that weren't their own. Ayu's memories, of being carried down temple steps, of cold coral pressed against her skin, of whispers in the water telling her she was chosen, of growing up with a smile she didn't understand and a silence she wasn't allowed to question, of the first time she kissed Made, of the moment she felt herself split in two, one girl of the land, one bride of the deep. The village healer, a woman in her 80s, hung herself that night. She left behind a message written in salt across her floorboards. I dreamed her pain and could not hold it. Even animals began to act strangely. Goats stared at the sea for hours. Birds nested only in hair, black strands pulled from unseen sources, dangling like offerings from tree limbs. Cats disappeared entirely. And then the banyan tree bled. One morning, red sap oozed from its trunk, thick, dark, and smelling unmistakably of salt. The villagers gathered in silence, watching the sacred tree mourn something they could not name. Someone whispered, "She's dreaming through us now. We are not the ones dreaming." Made became the center of it all. Wherever he went, dreams followed. People avoided him, then blamed him, then begged him to confess again, to undo the wedding, to dive into the sea and give himself in her place, to speak her name aloud at dawn, to burn his own hair, to let her have him. But he had no answers, only dreams. In one, he stood on the ocean floor, except it wasn't a floor. It was her body, her back, her arms, her hair. He knelt there, tried to speak, but the water filled his mouth. and Ayu turned her head to him slowly. Her eyes were empty sockets filled with pearls, her lips stitched shut with seaweed and regret. She touched his face, and through her fingertips he heard her thoughts. "You didn't choose me, you claimed me. Now I claim you. You wore a ring, I wore chains. Now we trade." He awoke gasping, mouth full of seawater. Again, but this time the bed was dry. It was his lungs that weren't. And outside his window, hanging from a nail on the doorframe, a bundle of hair, braided, tied with their wedding ribbon, still wet. The villagers gathered once more, under the banyan tree, under clouds that never moved, beneath a sky that had forgotten to change. Ibuluso stood before them, clutching the old scriptures. She read them with cracked lips and trembling hands. The dead dream backward. The sea remembers in circles. If the bride is not given, she will take. If her eyes are sewn shut, she will see through yours. If she is not burned, she will drown what you love. The dreams were no longer confined to night. People began to see things while awake. Hair slithering under the floor, mirrors filling with water, children speaking in voices that were not their own, and the veil, always the veil, appearing in places it had no right to be. In the well, on the altar, tied to a newborn's wrist. Then, one morning, the sun did not rise. The light came, but not from above. It came from beneath the sea. A pale green-blue glow, like something waking up, like something waiting.
The scholar arrived quietly, with no announcement. No one noticed her at first. She wore no priest's robe, no headdress, no offerings in her hands, just a satchel of aged scrolls and eyes that had seen too much for a woman still young. Her name was Dewi Saras. She was born in the mountains, raised by a family that served the gods of rivers and sky. But her studies took her into stranger depths. She studied the dead, not how they died, but how they refused to leave. And when news reached her of a bride who would not burn, she came walking down the jungle path alone. She arrived in silence, but silence didn't mean peace. The village was fraying. Eyes sunken, voices hoarse, dreams bleeding into daylight. Children drew Ayu's face in the dirt without ever seeing her. And the sea had begun to tremble. Not move, tremble. Dewi Saras sat beneath the banyan tree, opened her scrolls, and began to read aloud. Not for the villagers, for something else. "There is a name," she said softly, "for those who die before their soul is anchored. In the ancient rites, we call them Lelangi Takawin, the unmarried dead. They are not ghosts, not demons, not spirits of revenge. They are incompletes, souls halted mid-journey, pulled between one world and the next." She turned to Made. Her voice was firm. "You gave her a ring, but you never gave her the sea. She was promised twice, once in ritual, once in love, but she was received by neither. So now she is bound by a third vow, the vow of unfinished death." Ibulu nodded. Her old hands trembled, but her voice did not. "The sea is her husband, the land is her prison. The fire was never hers." Made fell to his knees. He begged to know what to do. "Take me instead," he whispered. "Let her go. Let her burn. Let her pass. I'll walk into the tide if I must." But Dewi shook her head. "It's not about you. It's not about what you're willing to lose. It's about what she was never given." She unrolled another scroll, this one older, more fragile. Its ink faded like memory. It told of a forgotten ritual, a binding known as perkawinan laut, the marriage to the sea. When a child is promised to the water, they must return in adulthood, willingly to perform a rite of surrender under moonlight. Only then may they walk the land freely. Only then is the sea content. Ayu never performed this rite, she said. She never knew she had to. She loved, she wed, but the ocean kept the receipt. The villagers murmured. Whispers became waves. Some wanted to redo the ceremony. Some wanted to burn what was left. Some wanted to leave the village entirely. But Dewi warned them, "You cannot run from a wedding you've already attended." She is not chasing you. She is pulling herself back, and your dreams are the thread. That night, Dewi and Ibolu prepared a divination of the bones, a sacred act to speak to spirits lost between realms. They laid Ayu's veil over a table of driftwood. They placed black pebbles in a circle, one for each knot the hair had formed. And then they asked one question. "What do you want?" The wind stopped. The candles bent inward, and the veil rose. Not all at once, but as if someone beneath it was breathing in. Hair unraveled from the corners. It moved like limbs. And on the surface of the veil, words began to darken. Not ink, not blood, salt. Crystallized letters. "Finish what you left undone. Bring me home. Seal the bond." Dewi Saras understood. She does not want release. She wants completion. If we cannot burn her, we must wed her to the sea. The villagers were silent. No one had ever wed the dead before, certainly not to a god. But Dewi reminded them, this is not about marriage. It's about restoring balance between what was taken and what was promised. So they planned the ritual, one final offering, a sea wedding at the place where Ayu had drowned, where the coral cut her feet, where the tide claimed her heart. And for the first time in weeks, the dreams that night were quiet. Not peaceful, but quiet, like something listening, like something waiting.
The moon was a thin, bone-colored coin in the sky, pale and distant, as though it too feared what was about to unfold. The village stood gathered in silence along the shore. No drums, no bells, no chants, only wind and salt. So much salt. At the farthest edge of the reef, where Ayu had drowned, a sacred platform had been built, not of wood, but coral and black stone. Old, uneven, bound together by barnacles and prayer. It was here that the Perkawinan Laut, the marriage to the sea, would be remade, not for the living, not even for the dead, but for the unmarried spirit who could not leave. Dewi Saras led the ritual, clothed in gray, with hair tied back by seaweed thread. Ibulu stood beside her, holding a jar of salt that had been gathered only from tears, human and divine. And Made wore white, the color of widowers, the color of surrender. He said nothing as he stepped barefoot onto the platform. He carried two things in his trembling hands, Ayu's veil
and the comb she had left behind, both soaked in brine, both humming with something not of this world. The villagers watched with hollow eyes. Some wept, some prayed, others simply stared, too drained to believe or fear, only witness. The ritual began with silence, then the sprinkling of salt in a spiral, each grain a word, each circle a vow. Dewi chanted in the old tongue, words once whispered by high priests who no longer had names. From tide to breath, from promise to ash, what was split shall be sealed. What was taken shall be returned. She turned to Made. "Speak your vow," she said. His voice cracked like driftwood underfoot. "I gave you my hand, but not my truth. I called you wife, but never gave you the sea. Tonight I offer both, not to bind you to me, but to set you free." The air thickened. The tide, far in the distance, began to creep forward, not in waves, but in fingers, thin, silent, stretching. There we placed the veil on the platform, the comb beside it, and finally, the urn. The one that held Ayu's hair, now overgrown, spilling from its cracks like vines seeking soil. Ibu Lu uncorked it with shaking hands. The hair moved, breathed. Made reached into the urn. He did not flinch. He pulled forth a single strand, long, black, wet. He wrapped it around his wrist like a bracelet and whispered, "I return what was never mine to keep. Let the ocean receive her bride." Then he stepped into the spiral. Salt beneath his feet, the sea now at his back, the veil fluttering without wind. The moment his foot touched the final ring, the air broke. A low sound, not thunder, not waves, but weeping. The kind of weeping that comes from deep beneath the earth, from wombs emptied too soon, from promises drowned. The sky darkened, the reef shook, and from the water she came. Not fully seen, not fully shaped, but present. Hair trailing behind her like a bridal train that stretched across the reef, face hidden beneath the veil. Her feet did not touch the stone, but she moved forward, slowly, toward the spiral. Made fell to his knees. The hair around his wrist tightened. He did not cry, he did not beg, he only whispered, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." She stopped inches from him. The veil rose, not from wind, but from choice. And there was Ayu, not alive, not dead, not whole. Her eyes were filled with ocean, her lips sewn shut with coral thread. But she looked at him, and in that look he saw it all: love, loss, betrayal, longing, and something else. She reached toward him. Her fingers, wet and trembling, brushed his face. And where she touched, salt bloomed, white, crystalline, pure. Then she took back the veil, took back the comb, and vanished into the sea, into the deep. The tide swallowed her in silence. No wave, no splash, only salt. Mada remained kneeling, eyes closed, breathing shallow, hair wet against his brow. and the spiral, the salt spiral, began to dissolve. Not from feet, not from hands, but from peace. The villagers dared not speak, not that night, not ever again about what they saw. The veil was never found, the comb never surfaced, but the urn, emptied, dry, sat in the center of the reef until the next full moon, when it too was gone.
The sea had taken her, but it had not returned to itself, not yet. Days passed, then a week. The villagers waited for a sign that balance had been restored, that the tide would return with gifts instead of silence, that the dreams would stop, that the crying would end. But Ayu's absence became another presence. She was gone, but not gone. They no longer dreamed of drowning. They dreamed of watching from the ocean floor, through her eyes, from beneath the reef, staring up at the world that had failed her. Children heard her voice in seashells, not whispering, just breathing, as though the shell itself remembered the lungs that once tried to scream underwater. One boy said Ayu sat beside his bed at night. She didn't speak, she didn't move, but she combed her own hair over and over, even when there was no hair left, just the gesture, just the memory of what it meant to feel human. Made stopped speaking entirely. He wandered the village like a shadow of himself, pale, thin, salt crusted in his eyebrows, his hair matted with dried sea foam. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep. He only stood at the shoreline, waiting. Some whispered he was cursed, others said he was blessed, the only one she hadn't taken, the only one she still loved. But Made didn't know what he was, only that when he closed his eyes, he could feel her fingers in his hair, not pulling, just brushing, like she once did in the quiet of their wedding chamber, before the fire, before the drowning, before the breaking of all things sacred. One night, under the blood moon, he saw her again, not in dreams, in foam. The tide had returned, but it was thin, sickly, moving as if hesitant, as if afraid of its own memory. And there she stood, Ayu, her hair longer than ever, stretching into the waves behind her like a bridal veil made of kelp and night. She didn't walk, she rose, dripping, silent, beautiful in the way grief makes even ruins seem holy. Made stepped into the tide. It touched his feet like fingers pressing a wound. He opened his mouth to speak, but the wind stole his voice, and Ayu lifted her hand, not to beckon, not to curse, but to show him. She turned, and with her turning, the ocean opened, not physically, not visibly, but in the way a heart opens when it breaks. A vision poured into him. Her final moments beneath the reef, the pressure of coral against her spine, the cold hands pulling her downward, the betrayal, not of him, but of the system that traded her soul between gods and men like a debt unpaid. He wept, not from fear, from shame. He whispered, "You never wanted the fire. You never wanted the ring. You only wanted a choice." Ayu turned back to him. Her mouth moved, the threads once sewn now gone, but she made no sound. She only mouthed a single word,
still. And then she vanished, pulled gently into the tide like silk into silk. No violence, no wrath, just water returning to itself. Made stood there until dawn. The salt ate the skin on his legs. His feet bled into the sand, but he did not move, because now he understood. She was not haunting them. She had been haunted by them, by promises made before she could speak, by rituals she didn't choose, by flames that stole her flesh, but not her freedom. Ayu had not been a bride of the sea. She had been its prisoner, and in breaking the bonds, they had set her adrift, not into peace, but into longing. And now she stood between two worlds, not to harm, but to remember, to watch, to wait, until the living learned to love the dead without owning them. From that day forward, the sea never fully returned. It remained shallow, reluctant, wounded. The village adapted. They drank from wells farther inland. They grew their crops in silence. They avoided weddings near the reef. And each year, on the night of her drowning, they left no offerings, only silence, only salt, and a strand of black hair braided into the wind.
They could not forget her. Even as the sea receded, even as the hair stopped growing, even as the dreams turned to silence, Ayu remained, not as ghost, not as goddess, but as a wound. An open, salted wound in the body of a village that thought rituals could erase guilt. But guilt leaves echoes, and echoes become instructions. The veil never returned, but her presence still did. Sometimes in the stillness before rain, sometimes in the hush between tides, and once in the body of a girl who hadn't spoken in years, but suddenly looked up during morning prayers and said, "You never burned me properly. You gave me fire, but no farewell. You gave me death, but no goodbye." The elders met again, their faces older, their hands more wrinkled, their courage worn thin by years of spiritual erosion. They looked to Ibulu, who had stopped speaking entirely since the moon turned red. They looked to Dewi Saras, who remained, studying what had never been written. And finally, they looked to Made, still alive, still salt-marked, still walking the reef each day as if expecting Ayu to rise from it as she once did. It was Dewi who said the words none dared speak. We must return her to the sea. Not with marriage, not with fire, with surrender. So they built a raft, not the way they did for offerings, but the way they once did in ancient times, when no priest was left to guide the rites, and only grief remained to tell the truth. They placed what little they had, a bridal sash, the broken comb, the cracked urn now empty, and a bundle of her hair still preserved in a sealed clay bowl, untouched by rot, flame, or time. They wrapped it in white linen soaked in salt water and tied it with black thread. No gold, no flowers, no chanting, just silence, just tide, just truth. The night they sent her off, no one came to watch. Only the ocean, Only Made. Only the moon. He lit a single flame and placed it beside the bundle, not to burn her, but to guide her. The raft drifted out to sea, slow and still. The tide moved differently that night, gentler, almost protective, as if the water remembered her now, not as debt, not as bride, but as daughter. Then, far from shore, the wind shifted. The flame flickered, then rose. It did not consume, it revealed. For one moment, the entire raft shimmered, hair, linen, salt, memory, glowing with a light that did not belong to this world. And then it sank. No fire, no sound, no protest. Just water closing over it, like lips closing over a secret. The morning after, the tide returned. Not as before, not strong, not deep, but present, like a voice hoarse from weeping, trying to speak again. The banyan tree, long cracked and bleeding, dropped one green leaf. Only one, enough to say life is still possible. But in the temple, something had changed. The veil, the one that had disappeared, was found again, folded, dry, placed carefully on the altar. Beside it, a single shell. Inside the shell, a pearl. Inside the pearl, nothing. But somehow, it felt like her. Then came the final sign, the hair. No longer moving, no longer multiplying, still, silent, dead. And yet, when they tried to burn what remained, not in hate, but in closure, the hair fought back. The flames recoiled, the bowl cracked, and the strand coiled upward like a snake awakened too soon. Not violently, but warningly. Dewi Saras stepped forward. She knelt. She placed her hand on the altar and whispered, "Some things are not meant to burn. Some grief must be buried, not erased." So they dug a grave, not in earth, but in salt. A shallow pit behind the temple, lined with crushed coral and tears. They laid the hair to rest there. They sang no songs. They carved no stone. They simply pressed the salt down like soil and walked away. And that night, for the first time in years, no one dreamed. No one drowned in sleep. No one woke with hair in their mouth. Ayu was not gone, but she was asleep. And the village finally let her sleep. The sea had stopped speaking. No more weeping in the wells. No more salt falling from the sky. No more hair and mouths or mirrors or dreams. Only silence, but not peace. The villagers took it as a sign. They resumed the rituals, cautiously, humbly. Marriages resumed under banyan leaves, not near the tide.
Babies were bathed in mountain water. The temple was cleansed, not to erase what had happened, but to remember it. And once a year, on the night Ayu had drowned, they left no fire, only salt and silence. But not everyone returned to life, not Made. He lived alone now, in a hut at the edge of the reef where the tide had once pulled her away. He no longer walked to the village, no longer looked anyone in the eye. Each morning he walked barefoot into the surf, up to his knees, then stood still, as if waiting to be swallowed. But the ocean never touched him. His hands shook, his eyes were clouded, not from age, but from salt. It had crept into the whites, staining them with a pale blue glow. He spoke to no one, only to the sea. "She's not gone," he would whisper. "She's only resting. She'll come back if I wait long enough." One night, he awoke choking, not on hair, on seawater. It filled his lungs without warning, as though he'd forgotten how to breathe like the living. He staggered outside, coughing brine, collapsing on the sand. When he opened his eyes, the moon had vanished, and the sea was flat as stone, dead calm. But something in it shimmered just beneath the surface. He crawled toward it, felt the cold kiss of tide against his fingers, and saw it. A figure beneath the water. Not swimming, not drifting, standing, still, patient. Hair floating around her like a crown, her face turned upward toward him. But she didn't rise, not this time. Instead, the sea pulled back, not in rage, not in curse, but in rejection, as if even the ocean no longer wanted what he had become. The next day, he wrapped the old coral ring, the one she had once worn, in cloth and placed it beneath the banyan tree, not as an offering, as an apology. But the cloth was gone by morning. The ring was not. He understood then. She had accepted the sea. She had moved on, but he was still tethered, not by hair, not by spirit, but guilt. And guilt, unlike hair, cannot be burned, only carried. He aged quickly. Salt does that to the soul. His fingers curled inward, his spine bent like the twisted limbs of driftwood bleached under too many moons. But each day he walked into the sea, and each day it receded before his feet. He was the only man in the village the tide refused to touch. Some say it was punishment, others say it was mercy. To be left behind, to be unclaimed, to be remembered by no one but the waves. One night, long after even the children forgot the name Ayu, Made vanished. No body was found, only footprints in the sand, leading to the sea and stopping mid-step. The villagers searched briefly, but they already knew. At low tide, a child wandering the reef found a circle of black hair braided into the coral. It was dry, perfectly preserved, like it had never been in water. And in the center of the braid, a ring, coral, cracked, worn by time, still warm. They buried it behind the temple. No ceremony, no chants,
just salt and silence. Because some things the sea gives back, and some things it keeps. Not out of anger, not out of love, but because the ocean understands there are wounds too deep to heal, and some names that can only be spoken in drowning.
Years passed, and then more. Banjar Pangalon became just another name on a map tourists didn't visit, a quiet coastal village surrounded by jungle, rumor, and stories best told at dusk. Time softened the salt. Children laughed again. Fishermen returned to the sea. But the reef remained bare, and no one built near the shoreline ever again. The temple still stood, but the prayers had changed. Now there was a new chant, spoken low, almost like a secret. Let what was taken remain taken. Let what was given remain given. Let what was buried in salt stay buried in silence. They said it not for the gods, but for her. No one spoke Ayu's name aloud, but everyone knew it, like the name of a storm no longer forming, but still present in the wind. Children born years later whispered of a woman in the sea, with black hair like ribbons in the tide, with eyes like pearl glass, with a voice that sounded like water remembering how to cry. They said if you swam too far past the reef, you'd feel her fingers brush your ankles, not to pull you down, just to remind you she was still there, waiting. Not for vengeance, not for love, just for witnesses. In time, another village was built nearby. New homes, new temples, new people who never heard the story. But the sea remembered. One morning, a young girl combing her hair at the edge of the surf screamed. When her parents ran to her, they found her pointing at the sand. There, laid out neatly between her feet, was a braid. Black, perfect, still wet. Others began to notice too. Hair washing ashore with the tide, woven into shells, coiled in driftwood, left in the hollows of dead fish. No matter how many times it was buried or burned or scattered, it returned. It didn't hurt anyone, not anymore, but it never stopped. It became part of the legend. The girl who belonged to fire and sea, the bride who was given without asking, the ghost who never chose to haunt, only refused to be forgotten. And so the story changed, shifted from curse to caution, from horror to haunting, from ghost to guardian. Tourists once came to see the reef, but they didn't stay long. They said the sea there felt too heavy, too thick, too still, as if it held its breath even at high tide. And in one cafe nearby, there's a drawing on the wall. Charcoal on rice paper. Simple. Strange. A woman in a wedding veil. Her hair surrounds her like storm clouds, full of teeth. Below the picture, someone has written, "She is not dead. She is remembering." And if you ask the old man sweeping outside what it means, he'll tell you, some things won't burn because they shouldn't, because they weren't meant to be forgotten, because what was taken too young doesn't rest, it waits. And if you walk the reef at low tide, you might find a single strand of black hair caught between coral. It won't move in the wind, but if you touch it, it will be warm, as if it remembers your hand, as if it knows you're part of the story now too. Because some spirits pass on, Some are set free, but others remain, not to haunt, not to curse, but to keep the promise no one else did. And when they find you, it won't be with teeth, it won't be with fire, it will be with hair, still wet, still alive, still unburned, because what the sea claims is never truly returned.